I'm Fred Terna. I now live in Brooklyn, and during the war I was in Terezin as one of many prisoners or inmates of that concentration camp. I did not come to Terezin until 1943. Terezin was my second camp. I had been in a camp in Lipa, L-I-P-A, from October 3rd, 1941, and I was shipped from there to Terezin in March of 1943. I stayed in Terezin until the fall of 1944, when I was shipped to Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, most of the people in my transport were gassed, killed right there. I was pulled out of that transport in the so-called selection because I was then 21 years old and able-bodied and supposedly available or suitable for labor. I was sent from Auschwitz to a sub-camp of Dachau named Kaufering, and I was liberated there on April 27, 1945. If you add it up, it is 3 years, 6 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Terezin was a transit camp for most of the Jews from Bohemia and Moravia. All had come from somewhere, and most of them wound up in death camps, either Treblinka or Auschwitz. That is, my fate was parallel to theirs. I came from one camp and eventually wound up in Auschwitz. All in all, approximately 155,000 people went through Terezin, and more than 33,000 died there. Close to 90,000, I think the exact figure is 87,000 and something, were shipped from Terezin to death camps. When the war was coming to an end, there were 10,000 people in Terezin. Everybody else having either been shipped east and died there, or died in Terezin. So this quote-unquote good camp was not really what it was supposed to be. Terezin was a fortress built on the confluence of two rivers, the Labe and Ochre River. In German it's Elbe and Eger rivers. And built there in the 1780s as a fortress town to defend Bohemia against the threat from Prussia, from the north. Like all military projects, by the time it was complete, it was obsolete, and never was besieged, sort of the final insult to a fortress. Terezin itself was a walled compound, that is, there were heavy walls, rings of walls, with a central core in which there were several large barracks, that is, multi-storied buildings. Eventually, in the population, there were, as an added population, were stores, pubs, bordellos, such facilities as an army headquarters or an army camp would attract. At most, both the population of Terezin and the garrison had 7,000 people in that compound. During the war, at times close to 60,000 people were jammed into that same area. Terezin started as a concentration camp or camp, or as the Germans called it, Ghetto Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt is the German word or German name for Terezin. Theresienstadt because the fortress was named after Maria Theresia, the mother of Joseph II, who ordered that fortress to be built. Terezin started in 1941 when two large groups from Prague, so-called AK-1 and AK-2 Aufbaukolonne, were sent in to establish, to start to build the ghetto, or to start to build facilities for the ghetto. In the beginning, there were some barracks that were set aside where men lived, and then eventually women were in another set of barracks. As the indigenous population was moved away from Terezin, slowly all or most of Terezin became the Ghetto Theresienstadt. One of the things about Terezin that must be said from the beginning is that it was never a thing in itself. We cannot say this is what Terezin was. Terezin changed constantly from December 1941 to its last days in May of 1945, when it was liberated. It was in constant flux. The area that was part of the ghetto or the camp was changing, the rules were changing, nothing remained the same, neither did the population. That is, people came into Terezin and people left Terezin, so that very, very few people who had come in early were there when the camp was liberated, in fact only a handful. So that any statement about Terezin has to be quite specific. This is what happened then and then. What was true in 1942 in January was not true in October of 1942. When I came there in March of 43, it had one configuration which is quite different from the one in the summer of 44. So Terezin was in constant flux. In 1942, in January, the Nazis had a big conference in a suburb of Berlin, in Wannsee, W-A-N-S-E-E. The world slowly heard, the world outside Germany, about the atrocities, the murders, the killing of the Jews, and the Nazis somehow tried to do something about it. And they did two things. One was to establish a firm plan how to kill every Jew within their territory, but also to establish a fake place which was kind of a show-off, showing that this is what the Jews really, the conditions under which the Jews are living. And they decided that Terezin would be the place. It was convenient, it was easily defensible, that is easily guarded because of being a walled city. And it was in an area that was still sort of considered Central Europe. From that time on, many Germans who had somehow distinguished themselves from World War I on, for instance, an admiral in the German Marine, big generals, very, very well-known people were sent to Terezin under the pretext they'll be very privileged there, lovely accommodations would be available to them. And so at that time a contingent of German and Austrian Jews was brought into Terezin. Most of them were older people, so that the bulk of the population, while Jews from Bohemia and Moravia, which was sort of a cross-section with all ages. Those who had come from Austria and Germany, by and large, were much, much older. The Germans were well aware of what the outside world was pushing for. In fact, they tried to make some kind of a statement to the world: look how well the Jews are treated. At some point, the German Red Cross got interested in what was going on in Terezin. That was in 1942. They sent a group, a commission in, and that report was disastrous. In 1943, Jews from Denmark, some of the Jews who had not escaped to Sweden or had not been saved by the Danes, most of the Danish Jews were in a marvelous operation brought across the Sound to Sweden and saved, but a number of them were not, and those were brought into Terezin. The Danes at no time let the Germans forget that these were Danish citizens and pressured them until finally the Germans acceded in 1943 that yes, they would let some Red Cross, quote-unquote international Red Cross, inspect Terezin. Sometime late in 1943, a so-called beautification project started. And the town was partially changed. That is, a plan was developed by the Germans with the experience of that disastrous Red Cross visit on 42 in their mind. They were going to plan the trip very, very carefully. There would be an itinerary which has to be followed exactly. Everything within that itinerary had to be made in such a way as to give the best possible impression of Terezin. Houses along that route were painted, stores in which people lived were refurbished, new signs were made. In windows where one could normally see triple-decker bunks, the top bunks were sewn off. In the town square, a bandstand was built. There was, no detail was left unattended. A children's playground was built. Now, all this in areas where nobody had ever access to. That is, the town square was off-limits. It was actually boarded off by a high wooden fence, of which some of the pictures give clear evidence. The commission did come and consisted of a Swiss representative and 2 Danes. I understand there was a German representative there too. They came in and gave a glowing report about how beautiful the Jews were provided for. If they had taken 50 yards to either side, they would have seen reality. Eventually, a film was made, and that film was very, very carefully scripted. It was directed by a man who was well known in Central European movie making, Kurt Gerron. Gerron was a fine actor. He acted in the very first production of the Three-Penny Opera. He acted in movies. He was in The Blue Angel with Marlene Dietrich. He was charged with making that film. However, the script for the film came from the propaganda ministry in Germany. And the aim was rather simple. Make it look pretty as if to say, well, what else is new? It was shown to be a spa in Bohemia. Now, many other things happened around that Red Cross visit. And one of the items, the heavily overcrowded Terezín, was emptied of about 7,000 people so that it would be less crowded. These people were shipped to Auschwitz and killed there. Special art was made for the Red Cross. You have here a full set of pages made for the Red Cross. It was all made to look bland, pretty, peaceful, just a working community where nothing unusual happens, where everybody is happily working and being well taken care of. At the same time, obviously behind or just off the main guided path of the Red Cross, Terezín was as bad as ever. The worst group the group that suffered most in Terezín were old people. If you imagine a person in their 60s, perhaps 70s, coming from a middle-class background, suddenly being thrown into a concentration camp. It was not a killing camp as what Auschwitz was, where everybody sooner or later arrived, but even Terezín, as a transition from a relative normalcy, was something that most older people could not manage. If you imagine, they had their careers, they had children, perhaps grandchildren, and suddenly in their old age, they are thrown on an attic into a room with hundreds of other people with no privacy. These people suffered physically and emotionally. That is, many of them just gave up. Quite a few of them just turned over and died. The shock of transition was something that they could not handle. In fact, the group that handled the transition best were people who had somehow established their personality between 30 and 40 years old. They did better than anybody else, except for small children who somehow did not realize what was happening to them. And yes, they knew this was not what life was supposed to be, but yet they somehow had enough flexibility to roll with the punches. Also, much care was spent on children. That is, they got more attention than any other group. Obviously, old people got comparatively little attention. All of us, from my age, and I was 20 then, to people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, felt rather bad about old people because they were clearly the ones that suffered most. Yet with a limited supply of food, the internal administration was, that is, the Jewish administration, was forced to divide food. Now, obviously, a significant effort was made to give more food to children than to anybody else. Those who did heavy labor needed some extra food. And then there was the base food distribution that everybody got, including old people. And that is all that they got. So in a way, they had less than most other people, because I, for instance, as being part of a roving labor crew that was assigned here, there, wherever it was needed, got some extra food. They did not. I think that the fact that so many old people show up in the pictures of Frita and Fleischmann and the others says something. These were the people that we saw. Terezín was guarded by by Czech gendarmerie. That is, it was comparatively easy to guard the ghetto. While they were under total German command, these were Czech gendarmes, some of them all right, scared stiff that they would not be shot or otherwise harmed, so that on the surface they were all very grumpy and rough. However, we know that there were some that were not so. However, the internal administration, while run totally by the Gestapo and the SS, was assigned to a Jewish administration. That is, the mechanics of running Terezín was internal administration, from food distribution to the mechanics like water supply, electricity, assigning work to different crews. All this was done internally. It was always under total German command. However, there was an amount of leeway that is, it was nearly impossible for the Germans to have an SS man stand next to every prisoner. If you, I'm now coming back to old people, if you imagine an old person being in one of the barracks, let me say something about barracks first. There were huge structures, 3-4 stories high, built in the 1790s, primarily as storage areas for military supplies of the late 18th century. I don't know what they used in the 18th century, but obviously, you know, there was ammunition, there was blankets, I don't know, rifles, guns. These barracks had been emptied and people lived in those cavernous, deep rooms that were rather high ceilinged rooms, where very often there was one room behind the other, so that, for instance, the one that I was in, I had to pass through 3 such rooms before I came to my room. That was in the so-called Hanover Kaserne. Kaserne meaning barracks. In these barracks there were 3 tiered bunks. You have some pictures of them, and you can imagine what it means to have exactly enough room to lie down and maybe turn around, but not much more, one on top of the other. Now, if you were an old person, you could not possibly live on the top bunk because you just cannot manage to get up there. In fact, even getting to the second bunk was not easy for many people and impossible for many. Now, if an old person was therefore high up on the attic, and many old people were put on the attic, if you had to go to the bathroom or the latrine, it wasn't a bathroom, you had to come 4 flights down, cross a courtyard, and then find the place wherever the latrine was. Now, in summer that can be managed, but what about winter? When it's freezing outside, for an old person to negotiate that physically, even under the best conditions, was torture. To do that during the night was terrible. One of the things that was sparse in Terezín was water. A big barrack had a so-called washroom, that is a room that had a number of faucets where water was sort of dribbling down, not nearly enough, obviously cold water. The room was not heated. Therefore, keeping clean was an effort. Yes, there was a central laundry that processed some laundry of individuals. but not nearly large enough to take care of all the laundry in Terezin. So for an old person to come from that top floor all the way down and into the washroom, try to use cold water and find enough cold water to keep clean was nearly impossible. And before you knew it, Terezin was infested with fleas, with bed bugs, and in case of older people, with lice. When we look at the pictures of Terezin today, we do not see that. But it was ever present. You do not see the hunger, the gnawing hunger. And for old people, you can see in some of the drawings the despair, the having nearly given up. Younger people did not have that much of a problem. There was still enough energy in us to cope with all of this, roll with the punches, and as long as we were in Terezin, we were reasonably safe if we were not killed by disease, and there were epidemics from time to time. There was a typhus epidemic that killed quite a few people. Early in '43, quite a few people died of typhoid fever. And a younger person could manage. Not well, but could manage. Children were reasonably well taken care of. The middle group managed. And in fact, it is out of that middle group, aged group, that is from the early 20s to 50 or so, that most of the art that you have here has been created. We were assigned to various jobs. Mine was assigned to wherever something was needed to be done. Digging ditches, carrying lumber, fixing a roof, whatever was needed, there we were assigned to. It was called Hundertschaft. 100 means 100 in German. Some people had steady jobs, that is, they were assigned to the same place. One of the jobs, one of the very, very small units, was the so-called Zeichenstube, or the technical department, which made plans, drafts, posters, such graphic material which the Germans, in their insatiable demand for order and documentation, demanded of them. And you have some of it displayed here, and it was clearly done under precise German orders, what to do, how to do it, what the end result would be. However, that comparatively small group, and there were less than 20 of them at any given time, under the guidance of Fritter, Friedrich Tausig. Fritter is a contraction of the first three letters of his first name, F-R-I, and the T-A from Tausig. So he was known under the name of Bedřich Fritter. He was born Friedrich Tausig. In that Zeichenstube, art supplies were available. They were rather tightly controlled. However, material was there and obviously taken out of that Zeichenstube. Let's admit it was stealing. And we had a very, very simple ethic. It is absolutely moral and moral demand to steal from the Germans. That, however, you never steal from somebody else. So they stole paper right and left. And that is why some of these works here are done on good, solid paper. And why you find other sheets that are made on third-rate, very, very cheap paper, because that was all that was available. So most of my drawings were done on very, very bad paper, because that was all that I could find. Every now and then I'd get a scrap from somebody from the Zeichenstube, and that was a very, very cherished possession. Good piece of paper. Well, Zeichenstube, with that fine group of artists in it, Fritter being their boss, Peter Keen, a number of others, made art secretly after hours, and that is the bulk of this show. And you have to look at their work to find out what Terezin really was like. The Germans tried to show it with their propaganda art and with their fake film. The artists left us a legacy of what it was like. I was an artist in Terezin too. I started as a rank beginner in Terezin, and learned from a man, architect Franciszek Zelenka, how to draw using his technique. That is, I knew how to draw, but he taught me a technique. He occasionally found good paper for me. He never hesitated to help me, but every now and then he ran out of ink. And without ink you cannot draw well. I found a scribe, a sofer, that is the Hebrew word for a scribe, who knew from the Talmud how to make ritually proper ink for the Torah scrolls. And he said, well, I don't have all the ingredients, but we can fake some of it. It doesn't, after all, you're not writing a Sefer Torah, the book, this Torah scroll. And we got permission to go to the kitchens and scrape the bottom of the kettles of soot. And he added this and he added that. And before I knew it, I had a bottle of good, solid black ink. We were improvising. One of the things that come to me only now after many years is the fact that here is a group of artists, perhaps unique in art history, that made drawings, made a record with the full knowledge that if found out, they would die because of this. I do not know of any such event in the history of art. Most of the artists that you see here have perished. What their motivation was from person to person, I cannot tell. But somehow, in all of them pervaded the idea is, if I survive, I'm going to tell. And if I'm not going to survive, my work will tell. There's so much to be said about each individual drawing, and I think that Johanna Branson, who put that show together she and a group of others and did it at the Massachusetts College of Art, has done a magnificent job and knows quite a bit about the provenance of each work and what each item signifies.
This project began for me and my colleagues at the Massachusetts College of Art about 4 years ago, when one of us happened, really quite by chance, to see a group of drawings which were being exhibited in the State Jewish Museum in Prague, a tiny exhibit of only a few drawings. And this person, a painter named Henry Isaacs, was so dazzled by the drawings that he rushed right back to Boston to tell us about them. He was surprised that there were drawings of such beautiful quality which existed, and he had never heard of the artists before. So we began to study the situation really from ground zero. We knew nothing about Terezin except maybe what we'd heard from, or read really, in popular novels such as Herman Wouk's novels, War and Remembrance, or The Winds of War. So we just really had to begin digging, and we went back to Prague and we began to look in the archives, both of the State Jewish Museum, which at that time was a very struggling, completely underfunded, ignored institution housed in the old Jewish quarter of Prague, picturesque but without funds of any kind to show the work in their archives. We went there, as well as to the archives in the Terezin Memorial itself. The prison part of the attached to the ghetto had been turned into really a kind of state monument or memorial where tour buses can go and people can learn about Terezin. And they have a large archives there of drawings which were made in the camp. And we began to dig, and we got more and more excited. We were very intrigued at first with the idea of showing maybe the work of 4 or 5 artists whose work we thought was really outstanding. And we thought it would be so interesting to show the work they did before the war and then the work that they did during the war and how that work was affected by their having lived through this experience. And then in the couple of cases where it was possible to show what they did after the war. But as we became more acquainted with the material and learned more about Terezin, it seemed to us to be much more important to present enough work to show as much of the story of that place as possible in its years from 1941 to 1945. And also because we had come through our research to very much respect the people who had been at Terezin, to try to show work done by as many of them as possible, from the most professional, scintillating artists such as Frita, whom Fred Terna has already mentioned, to amateurs or people who called themselves amateurs, and that word belies again the depth of the culture of the population at Terezin. For example, a man like Dr. Karl Fleischmann, who was a dermatologist but who had studied art. It was a lifelong passion of his and had edited very experimental journals of art and poetry in his hometown before he was in Terezin, to work such as the work right behind me here on the wall, done by a young girl named Helga Weiss at that time, now Hoskova, who was 12, 13, and 14 years old when she was in the camp. We just decided there was so much wonderful work that we really wanted to show it all. The further thing which intrigued us probably the most as art historians was that we had never before seen a situation like Terezin in that we would be able to show work that was done by order, by order, prison order really, work that was done not just, you know, for pay, but work that was done that was forced work. And we would be able to hang it on the wall side by side with work that had been done freely, what the artist himself or herself really wanted to do. And we thought that giving the people who came to see the show the opportunity to see this work side by side would give them the opportunity to sort of scrutinize images often made of the same subject, at the same time, by the same person, but which looked utterly different. And when you see that, it makes you really begin to think about how you decide what it is you're going to believe, you know, how it is you decide, how you secure a sense of credibility from images, what kinds of images persuade you, and why. And the reason we could do this was, as Fred mentioned earlier, and this was not the case in any other camp that I know of, the artists did have access to these wonderful materials because of the technical drafting studio existing, the propaganda mill existing. So instead of just the small, sad scraps of paper that have sometimes survived from other camps, there are these great, gorgeous, enormous drawings, and that was a big surprise as we continued to dig in these archives. And what we could do, the further part of the story that became so interesting was that it emerged that there was a real strategy behind the images which were being produced to Nazi order. It became clear, to me at least, that the Nazis were carefully laying a trail of false documents. By late 1943 into the summer of 44, when they probably thought they were going to lose the war, or it was a real possibility, They wanted to try to leave a false history behind. And so increasingly, they had the artists depict Terezin as this fraud, which they had perpetuated all along, of it being just a work camp, not a transit camp as we know it was. But they further embellished this fraud. They turned it into not just a work camp, but almost a charming bohemian spa-like place in their set of drawings, which they ordered the prisoners to do. And we discovered sets of these. In fact, we got one set from the Red Cross in Geneva. It was actually the set of drawings which were attached as evidence to the Red Cross report. So we know that this is the view that the Nazis endorsed. And what's remarkable about it, about this suite of drawings, is that they are so utterly insipid. They are pastel, they're generic, you never see specific faces in them, you just see sights almost from the worst kind of stereotyped maybe movie of a bohemian town. You know, if you were going to show a typical bohemian town, you would show the bandstand in the park, you would show people shopping in the streets, you would show a coffee house, you would show people at their jobs. And each one of those is kind of ticked off as a topic in the 18 drawings which were ordered by the Nazis. And we, in this exhibit, had the chance to display them and then to show almost topic by topic a work that was done in secret contradicting the image that was made to order. My favorite one to compare is the coffee house. In the propaganda image of the coffee house, there's a grand piano. People are seated at tables with cups of coffee in front of them. There's a white-jacketed waiter carrying around a tray. You just see the backs of people's heads. You don't see any faces again. But the overall scene is one of charm, of Gemütlichkeit, to use the German word, of well-being. And this, in 1944, at the height of the worst end of what was soon to be the end of the war, or the beginning of the end of the war. Well, in Frida's depiction of the coffee house, we call it the no coffee coffee house because there's no coffee. The people are seated before empty tables with just their little tickets of admission. There was, in fact, a coffee house. One person who was there told me that he lived for the time once every 3 months when his turn came up to use his ticket to go, to hear a little combo of prisoners with their ratty old instruments, no grand piano, no white-jacketed waiter. And in this drawing, Frida has included the window from the coffee house, which looks out onto the main park, actually, and through that window, you don't see the flower-filled park that you see in the propaganda drawings. You see a barricade with a guard, which in fact was what existed at that time right outside the window. The Jews were confined to passageways very close to the buildings, and the park was reserved for the SS. So Frida has, at every point, undercut constantly. He kept undercutting what was the general sweetness and light of the propaganda drawings. And he does it in drawing after drawing, so that we very much hope that viewers will go from the propaganda drawings to, for example, Frida's drawings again and again, to compare and to learn to think as critically as possible about what they're looking at. And I think what they'll find, at least what I found, and this surprised me because my stereotype of propaganda was the kind of shrill anti-Semitic posters, caricatures of Jews, with which I think a lot of us are familiar or have seen. And instead, the propaganda from Terezin was really bland. It seemed to serve just to shut people's minds down, to get them not to ask questions about what was going on in the camp, to get them to think that there was no cause for concern. And it worked with the Red Cross. It worked, or it seems to have worked. Frida's art, on the other hand, one of the reasons that I love his drawings so much, and 4 years later I'm still constantly finding new things in them, is that in each drawing he put layers of things, layers of meaning. They raise questions in your mind. They make you wonder what was really going on. He doesn't tell you what to think. He instead suggests questions that you might want to ask. For example, a very interesting drawing in what we in art history probably unfortunately would call a very advanced drawing. It's extremely experimental drawing of where the drawing often occurs actually where he scratched through the basic waxy medium, and in it he includes bombs dropping, a gallows, the same big dark birds which are probably like crows or ravens that he includes in many drawings, a creature, a person at the bottom full of anguish, gazing up as if out of a bunker up at the sky. And you look at it and it's so dark you have to get very close and really peer at it, and you try to puzzle out what's going on here, what's happening. And it seems to me to just be a compendium, a drawing which is a compendium of despair about war in general. He also, however, did not hesitate to get quite specific in depicting Terezín itself. He came out of a cultural milieu in Prague which was full of tremendously innovative artists in the 1930s. Very advanced surrealism was being explored there, as well as Cubism, really everything. They were very familiar with everything that was going on, and they themselves were very innovative as well. There were waves of refugees coming through from Germany through Prague in the 30s, and he seems to have been utterly familiar with their work. And his work, in addition, was published abroad before the war. And so you can see his stylistic experimentation in others of his drawings. For example, the one that is called The Shops in Terezín, which we call the Potemkin Village, has many things going on in it. It has the false fronts of the shops as they were spruced up for the Red Cross visit in the film, exposed as what they are as false fronts, with just being propped up from behind with corpses behind the cosmetic fronts. There's, in the far right distance, you see a wall, the wall at the edge of the ghetto, with a small door and these same dark birds and dark trees that he depicted over and over again. The facades of the buildings themselves have these very typical architectural detail of the time of a little, what's called an eyebrow window, because it's shaped like an arch. He's turned that eyebrow window into an eye, and the eye becomes a symbol of who is looking, who are you looking, who is being watched, who is watching. In the left-hand part of the drawing is a couple embracing beneath a window where there is the specter of a corpse looking down. So he's just raising every question he possibly could about the nature of the town itself. He does that repeatedly. He does it in another drawing which depicts the filmmaking itself, where again a person being filmed is seated before a curtain. Behind the curtain are corpses. The machine, the actual filmmaking machine, has been turned into a hybrid surrealist monster of a machine that is taping. There is a makeup girl standing in front of this poor old man being filmed, and she's half makeup table and half woman. It's like all cosmetics, you see, being revealed. He does it, I could go on for a long time about Frida. And the more I look at his drawings, and the more people have come up to me during the exhibition in Boston and New York, people who were in Terezín, to give me specific information, the more I realize that every detail of his paintings is significant and is something that was real. Another interesting thing about his drawings is that there is a kind of code in some of them. Of all the artists, I believe that he really did try to get his drawings out of the camp. He really consciously believed that it was his responsibility to try to record in his drawings the truth of the camps. And he secreted in some of the drawings, embedded in the texture of the surface, the V, which stands, or hung it around people's neck, put it on the fronts of buildings, which stands for the V for victory that the Allies used during the war. He repeats numbers over and over again as if the people had become only numbers in the camp. There's so much to say. One of his most beautiful and most eerie drawings in my memory, always much larger than it really is a very small drawing of baby carriages abandoned beneath enormous trees. Baby carriages which were wheeled out and placed for the Red Cross team to see on their visit, which was the deepest irony since it was forbidden to conceive or to carry through pregnancies in Terezin. But there are so many different kinds of artists who worked. One, I think, who deserves the most special attention is Helga Vaisova-Hoskova, whose work is behind me here on the wall. As I said earlier, she was just a girl when she went to the camp. She had been always a very promising artist, and her parents took care to pack art materials in the few pounds of luggage they were allowed. So she had watercolors, some colored pencils, some good paper, which begins to, during her stay at Terezin, you can almost date some of her pictures because the colors began to disappear as she used up her materials. She put in certain kinds of code as well. In some of the drawings, she would put notes to herself. She would put a number on the side of a suitcase that said R for year in Czech, 942, which stood for 1942. The drawing shows a transport, and that was to remind herself that there were already transports of prisoners being sent out of Terezin to the east, to the death camps, immediately after the camp was founded, so that it was never just a work camp, it was always a transit camp. She's also, I think, special among the artists because she was a girl, and she includes very different kinds of information than a lot of the more mature artists and the professional men did in their drawings. She includes the everyday events and difficulties that people lived with. She shows people trying to air out their bedding and get rid of bed bugs. She shows people searching for head lice. She shows the difficulty of using the latrines, which were filthy and broken down. Sometimes she turned these into jokes. The latrine one was one of her most popular drawings. She made many copies for her friends. And alone of all the artists I know, she literally depicted the beautification for the Red Cross visit, which Fred Terna described to you earlier. She depicted the sawing off of the third layer of bunks so that the bunks within view of the team would only be 2 tiers high. She depicted in one especially wonderful drawing a Jewish guard from the camp queuing people to enter with baskets of flowers which had just been flown in from Holland, we know, as people in the background of the painting are scurrying to finish hanging curtains and whitewashing the buildings and bringing out bakers with white gloves and lots of bread, because in the upper left-hand corner you see the limousines of the Red Cross team approaching. So she made very explicit record of what a fraud it all was. She said that she could draw quite openly, and she thinks that because she was a child, she just was not suspected of any wrongdoing, so-called, by the Nazis, and so she was able to be very honest. She depicted children receiving illegal schooling. Helga's own favorite image of all the drawings she made is one which depicts a hearse. Old, very ornate black Victorian hearses appear in a lot of the artist drawings. They were brought out from the old Jewish quarter in Prague. Helga thinks it must have only been some kind of psychological warfare on the Jews in the camp, because they were not ever used for coffins. They were only used to carry bread, people. Wagons were used for the coffins. And in this drawing, she has the children from the Jugendversorge, or youth care camp, pulling a hearse that has their own name on the side of it. It's loaded with bread. And so she wanted to make almost an icon of what it was like to be a child surrounded by death, with the fraud of ample food all together in one image, and it's a very graphically striking image. She also sketched people being awakened in the middle of the night to be notified that they were to get ready to go on transports, which she said is what often happened. She recorded everything. She's had these drawings stored under her living room couch in her apartment since the end of the war. She was herself, with her mother, shipped on out to Auschwitz. She and her mother survived. Her father did not. She handed on the drawings to a relative who handed them on to another relative. As they were shipped out, they would hand them on to someone who stayed. And after the war, she was able to recover her drawings. And they have not been exhibited before. I think she's one of the most remarkable artists in a way I've ever met, and certainly for a 12 or 13-year-old child, she was had amazing sensitivity. Another artist who is well, there are two more artists I would like to mention. One is, I mentioned earlier, who was the doctor, Carl Fleischmann, mostly because he drew obsessively, and the tangled, tense line of his drawings, I think, captures more of a feeling of the crowding of the camp than any other artist. And he drew many drawings, hundreds of drawings, and we're able to show quite a few in this exhibit. I'm very happy about that. The other artist was a young man named Peter Keen, who was only 22 when he went into the camp. He made many oil paintings. That was his work in the camp for the Nazis, depicting the SS hierarchy. But in his off hours, he did his own set of portraits of the people around him, and there are 2 or 3 beautiful drawings like that in the camp, as well as a suite of very funny caricatures that he did of the doctors and the nurses in the camp, where in the upper right-hand corner of each drawing you see what that person daydreamed about or where they would rather be than in the camp. And I think his drawing demonstrates the wide range, the diverse purposes to which these images were put for the prisoners themselves to try to make their lives more tolerable and pleasant, although he was also capable of making very dark images, which he did. I don't think any of us who worked on this exhibition would presume to say that we knew these artists, but we certainly developed a very strong feeling for them over the years that we worked on the exhibit, very strong feeling for them. And I think that's what they would have wanted. I think their great hope was that in some way their art would be able to move people later. If they themselves did not survive, that their art would. And in a way, in a very strange way, I think they succeeded, although that may seem like a cruel thing to say since almost all of them died. Just putting this exhibit together has given me an eerie kind of hope that the power of art is real and tangible.